In another news that we're tracking very closely on WION for the past few days, the white gunman who shot and killed 3 black people in Jacksonville, Florida, has now been identified as a 21-year-old. Local law enforcement have said that he bought his guns legally and had no criminal history. They've also described the shooting as racially motivated. Well, the shooter, Ryan Christopher Palmiter, later killed himself at the scene. The sheriff said that he had written several manifestos that detailed his animosity towards the black community.
Now, he was also briefly held under a state law called the Baker Act in 2017. The law states that a person can be taken to a receiving facility for involuntary examination during a mental health crisis.
And I also want us to be clear that yes, they will try to sterilize what happened and blame mental health issues, but racism is not a mental health issue. They will try to sterilize this and say that in our communities, there's more black on black violence, but let's be clear, that is a product of systemic racism.
And this is not the first time that such an incident has taken place. The impact of gun violence on black Americans is significant and have numbers to prove. While black Americans experience 12 times the gun homicides, 18 times the gun assault injuries, and nearly 3 times the fatal shootings by the police when compared to the white Americans.
Now, according to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been 28,000 gun deaths in the United States of America. Just this week, 4 people, including a gunman, were killed in a shooting incident at a bar in California. 6 more people were injured and taken to a hospital. On Sunday, a shooting near a restaurant in Louisville left at least 1 dead, 5 others injured by gunshots.
Not in this same in Chicago, rather, 2 women were shot and injured at a baseball game. Imagine. And these incidents, widespread across the nation, have been plaguing the United States of America.
Now, they came at a time when Americans celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Great March on Washington. 60 years since Martin Luther King Jr. gave his galvanizing "I Have a Dream" speech, where he advocated civil and economic rights and called for an end to racism in the United States of America. It's both ironical and Raisha, unfortunate, of course, that 60 years later, racism is still prevalent in the country.
And the attacks in Jacksonville, California, Louisville and Chicago are just a few of the many reminders of the same theme.
Absolutely. Now, for more on this, we have with us Mr. Stephen Golub, live from California. He's a political analyst and a lawyer. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Right, sir. To begin with, gun violence epidemic, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is also, it continues in the United States, an issue which has sparked fierce debates as well. What would you say are the factors that are contributing to this?
Well, we're a nation that loves guns. People want it for supposed home security. They want it as an expression of freedom. They want it to show the government that the government can't tell them what to do. And as a result, our rate of gun ownership is incredibly high compared to any other country on earth, more than twice as high as the second highest country, Yemen, which is a chaotic, war-torn nation. So the love of guns, the possession of guns means they're just more likely to be used when people otherwise might not resort to violence if they're feeling disturbed or if they are disturbed. Or even if they do resort to violence, they may use a knife rather than a gun to attack a bunch of people. So it's a sad fact of life in the United States compared to the rest of the world.
Right, Mr. Golub. Now, just to add to that, there are more guns in America than Americans themselves. And racially motivated crime, it continues to be a major cause of concern in America. What would you say are some of the structural issues which are required in American politics and culture to deal with this gun violence epidemic?
Well, one structural issue is just the way our democratic system is set up. The more rural states with lower populations have a disproportionate impact on our politics, partly, for example, because even a small state like Wyoming has 2 senators in the U.S. Senate. California, which has a population that's about 40 times that of Wyoming, only has 2 senators. And Wyoming's a more, for example, pro-gun state. Another factor that's gone on, whether or not we call it structural, is the impact, I hate to say, of Donald Trump and what he's injected into the body politics by legitimizing hatred, by legitimizing racism, sometimes explicitly, sometimes more explicitly, by legitimizing anti-immigrant sentiments. People who previously may have secretly harbored these feelings, this hatred, now feel it's okay to do that. It's okay to simply articulate it and feel it. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is responsible for all racism in the U.S. by any means or all gun violence, but he has fanned the flames that accounts for increasing rates of hate crimes, especially against blacks in the U.S., which has gone on, which has increased year over year for a number of years, including especially the years that he's been prominent in public life here.
Right, sir. Let's also talk about procuring arms. Now, would you reckon that the current systems perhaps do not run adequate background checks, and there is a need for a major overhaul here? What measures would you say need to be introduced for the same?
Oh, certainly a major overhaul. You mentioned background checks. Those tend to be vary from state to state, but they tend to be very loose in many parts of the country. The fact that an individual can own a military-style assault weapon, the one that was used in Jacksonville is an AR-15. It's the kind of weapon that the U.S. military has, is similar to what the Indian military and other major militaries across the world have. It's used for warfare. It's not used for home defense or shouldn't be used for recreation, which is what people have. So greater background checks. Number one, banning people who have a history of domestic violence or violent criminal record, number 2, and banning the use or the availability of these military-style weapons, which have no place in civilian use, but are very prominent in America, including used by the Jacksonville mass shooter that unfortunately just committed this heinous crime.
Right. Absolutely, Mr. Golub. Thanks so much for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us on this story.
Thank you.
Thank you.